A prime minister forced to resign, a parliament in ashes. The cause wasn't a military coup or a political assassination. It was a social media ban. This is the story of how Nepal's Gen Z protests brought a government to its knees in less than 72 hours. Kathmandu, September 8th. The official announcement came without warning, transmitted through state-run media channels shortly after midday. In a move Prime Minister KP Sharma Oli's office described as a necessary defense of national sovereignty and social harmony, the government of Nepal pulled the plug. Over 24 social media platforms, from global giants to smaller messaging apps, were ordered to cease operations within the nation's borders. The government cited concerns over non-compliance with new, vaguely worded registration mandates, which critics immediately labeled a thinly veiled crackdown on dissent. Ikram Giri, a spokesperson for the lower house of parliament, told Reuters the Online Information Act was designed to regulate digital spaces, not to silence them. But on the streets of Kathmandu, the distinction was meaningless. The decree was the catalyst, but it was not the core issue. The upheaval was not truly unleashed by a social media ban, but by years of simmering frustration. For a generation, a lack of viable jobs has driven millions of young Nepalis to seek work abroad, in countries like Malaysia, the Middle East, and South Korea, hollowing out communities and leaving behind a profound sense of abandonment. This economic despair was compounded by the government's perceived failure to fight endemic corruption, a problem that siphoned public funds and stifled any prospect of domestic growth. The digital world was the one space where this generation felt it had a voice, a community, and increasingly a livelihood. It was a vital link for families separated by economic migration and a platform for a burgeoning class of online entrepreneurs who had carved out a niche in the global gig economy. Prime Minister Oli, a veteran politician known for his nationalist rhetoric, seemed to fundamentally miscalculate the depth of this digital integration. In a press conference held that afternoon, he defended the ban as a stand against foreign tech companies that refused to adhere to Nepali law. His dismissive remarks, however, only added fuel to the fire.
When a reporter asked about the economic impact on the thousands of young people who relied on the platforms for income, Oli declared he didn't care if 2 or 4 people lost their jobs when the nation's integrity was at stake. The comment, intended to project strength, was instead perceived as an insult of staggering arrogance. It was a declaration that the government was not only out of touch, but actively hostile to the aspirations of its largest demographic. Within hours, the phrase went viral on the very platforms that were soon to go dark, spread through encrypted channels and VPNs. The anger, once diffuse and confined to hushed conversations, began to coalesce into a singular, potent force. This was not about compliance, it was about control. It was not about national sovereignty, it was about survival. The stage was set for a confrontation.
Kathmandu, September 9th, the first wave of protesters materialized near the main administrative offices of Singhadarbar the following morning. It was a movement without a leader, a protest without a political party. The word had spread not through official channels, but through a cascade of encrypted messages and the use of VPNs that circumvented the government's nascent blockade. They were young, digitally connected, and mobilized with a speed that caught the authorities by surprise. They chanted slogans against corruption and demanded the immediate reversal of the social media ban. They marched, they broke past the initial thinly staffed police barricades. The state responded with a crackdown. Riot police and protective gear formed tight cordons, deploying water cannons that sent plumes of spray arcing over the crowds. When the protesters refused to disperse, the air filled with the sharp, acrid smell of tear gas. Canisters hissed as they landed on the pavement, and clouds of white smoke sent people scattering, their eyes streaming. Soon, the thud of rubber bullets being fired into the mass of people became a grim percussion against the roar of the crowd. According to initial reports from the Nepal Health Ministry, dozens were injured in these first hours, overwhelming local clinics ill-prepared for mass casualty events. Armored vehicles kept vigil on the periphery, their presence a silent threat of escalating force.
This was the birth of what would be journalistically dubbed the Gen Z protests. The demographic was unmistakable: students, young professionals, and gig workers who felt their future had been unilaterally canceled by the government's decree. Their anger, however, went far beyond a social media ban. It was a visceral rejection of a political class they saw as antiquated and corrupt. They were a generation that had grown up in a Nepal struggling to find its footing since the abolition of its monarchy in 2008, wedged between the regional ambitions of India and China. They were vocal, assertive, and directly confronting state authority in a way that hadn't been seen in years. By late afternoon, the protests had spread across major cities, but the focal point remained Kathmandu, where burnt-out tires smoldered on major thoroughfares and the streets were littered with stones and debris. The government had expected compliance. What it received was a full-blown rebellion.
Kathmandu, September 10th. The second day of protests began with a tense calm that shattered before noon. A massive column of demonstrators, numbering in the thousands, marched directly on the nation's parliament building. They broke through a heavily fortified police cordon, overwhelming security forces with sheer numbers. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the streets as protesters stormed the gates. What followed was an act of symbolic defiance that would become the defining image of the crisis. Protesters set the building ablaze. Flames licked up the facade, and thick black smoke billowed into the sky, visible from across the Kathmandu Valley. Army firefighters battled to douse the blaze, but by the time they gained control, the main hall had been gutted, its exterior charred and blackened. The fire, a parliament security chief told reporters, had destroyed the entire infrastructure of the main assembly. The violence was not confined to parliament. Mobs targeted the Supreme Court, the private residence of Prime Minister Oli, and the homes of several ministers. An attempt was made to storm Kathmandu's Dili Bazaar jail. Burnt-out vehicles and twisted metal littered the area around the city center. This is not a war zone. This is Nepal. Hospitals, already struggling, were overwhelmed. The health ministry updated its figures continuously, each release more dire than the last. By evening, the death toll from the protests had risen to 19, with more than 600 injured. Reuters could not independently confirm all the information, but television footage showed chaotic scenes at emergency rooms, with medics treating wounds consistent with rubber bullets and blunt force trauma. It was in this atmosphere of escalating chaos that Suman Rai, a 20-year-old student, gave voice to the movement's resolve. Lying on a hospital bed with a bandaged head, he spoke to a local journalist. "If shedding blood is good for our future, then it was right for me to participate in the protests," he said, his voice steady despite the pain. "We have been left behind for too long. This government does not speak for us." His words, quickly disseminated through the remaining active communication channels, became an anthem for the protesters. They underscored a grim determination that the cost in lives was a price they were willing to pay for a future they could believe in. The city was in chaos, and the unrest showed no signs of subsiding.
Kathmandu, September 11th. The end of KP Sharma Oli's premiership came swiftly. With the capital paralyzed by a military-enforced curfew, parliament in ruins, and the death toll climbing to 25 by Wednesday morning, his position had become politically untenable. The unrest, which his government's actions had unleashed, began to subside only after the official announcement was made public. Taking moral responsibility for the crisis, Oli submitted his resignation. In a brief, televised address, he maintained that the social media ban had been a matter of principle, but acknowledged that his government had failed to contain the ensuing political fallout. His departure marked a stunning victory for a leaderless popular movement, and a stark warning about the power of a digitally mobilized populace. Immediately, the political landscape was thrown into uncertainty. Constitutional experts and opposition figures began publicly debating the path forward. Former Supreme Court Judge Balaram K.C. urged the protesters to form a negotiation team and called for the dissolution of the now damaged parliament to allow for fresh elections.
Parliament should be dissolved and fresh elections held, the constitutional expert told Reuters, arguing that only a new mandate from the people could restore legitimacy and order. The question of who would form the next caretaker government became the central topic of discussion among the political elite, even as soldiers patrolled the deserted streets outside. The main airport in Kathmandu, which had been closed for 2 days, cautiously reopened, an airport spokesperson confirmed, signaling the first tentative step toward a return to normalcy. The success of the Gen Z protests brought the Oli government's core challenge into focus. He had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of power in modern Nepal. It was no longer concentrated solely in the halls of government, but was also distributed across the digital networks of a generation that refused to be silenced. They had organized without a figurehead, spread their message through VPNs, and demonstrated a willingness to directly confront the state. Even with a curfew in place, the army remained on high alert. Army spokesman Raja Ram Bosnet confirmed that prohibitory orders would remain in force until Thursday morning, adding that strict action would be taken against any violations. The government had fallen, but the deep fractures in Nepali society remained.
The ultimate takeaway from the week of fire and fury was not about a single policy or a fallen prime minister. It was about a fundamental shift in the social contract. The events brought into sharp focus the emergence of a new political force, a digitally connected generation, mobilized, vocal, and increasingly assertive. Their anger, born from being left behind by the global economy and ignored by their own government, had proven potent enough to topple a regime. As a caretaker government was being negotiated behind closed doors, the young people of Nepal had made their power known. They had been on the streets, at the gates of parliament, and had directly confronted the authority of the state. A new, uncertain chapter for Nepal had begun. The events in Kathmandu serve as a powerful reminder that in the 21st century, the true challenge for any government is not controlling the flow of information, but earning the trust of a digitally connected generation that refuses to be silenced. The future of Nepal remains unwritten, but its authors may have already been chosen. Thank you for watching Default Content Channel. To stay informed on critical global events like this, don't forget to subscribe to Default Content Channel and hit the notification bell.